The city never truly sleeps, but in the dead of night, it reveals its darkest secrets. Beneath the faint hum of streetlights and the distant wail of sirens, shadows move with intent, carrying whispers of power, corruption, and violence. Eli Thompson had seen more than his fair share of darkness. A decorated Marine turned quiet civilian. He had traded battlefields for modest city streets, seeking peace in a world that often refused to give it. But tonight, as he walked home through the cold and desolate alleyways, there was a sense that something was coming. The kind of danger you feel in your gut before you ever see it. Eli wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And when it did, the men lurking in the shadows would soon realize they'd made the gravest mistake of their lives. They didn't know who they were dealing with, but they would. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful tales like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. The moon hung low over the city, its pale light slicing through the thin veil of mist that clung to the streets. Eli Thompson walked with a steady pace, his boots scuffing lightly against the cracked sidewalk. He kept his hands tucked deep in the pockets of his worn bomber jacket, every step resonating with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death more times than he could count. It had been a long day at the hardware store, a job he had taken to keep his mind occupied. Retirement from the Marines hadn't come easy. Civilian life felt foreign, almost suffocating at times, but Eli had adapted like he always did. Tonight, though, something gnawed at him, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The streets felt too quiet, the usual hum of the city muffled like a predator stalking its prey. As he turned down a dimly lit alley, a shortcut he often used, Eli noticed it, the flicker of movement just at the edge of his peripheral vision. He paused, his instincts honed from years in combat sharpening his senses. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made his skin prickle. He resumed walking, slower this time, his ears straining for sounds that didn't belong, the crunch of gravel, the shuffle of feet, the faint metallic clink of something heavy. His hand brushed against the small flashlight clipped to his belt, a harmless item to most, but one he could weaponize if necessary. "Relax, old man," he told himself, though the tension in his muscles said otherwise. The quiet scrape of a car engine pulled his gaze to the street ahead. A black SUV rolled to a stop at the corner, its tinted windows glinting under the pale streetlight. Eli's eyes narrowed as the vehicle lingered, its engine idling for a moment too long before speeding off into the night. "Just passing through," he muttered under his breath, though he didn't believe it. Eli's thoughts drifted as he walked, unbidden memories rising to the surface. The sound of chopper blades slicing through humid air, the acrid scent of smoke and gunpowder, the shouts of his comrades echoing in the chaos of battle, images of a life lived on the edge. He could still feel the weight of his rifle, the cold steel of the dog tags that now hung from his neck like a ghost of the past. He shook his head, trying to focus. Those days were behind him, though they'd left scars deeper than the ones visible on his skin. The city might not have been a battlefield, but danger had a way of finding him. A faint whistle pierced the night, sharp and mocking. Eli's steps faltered, his eyes darting to the source. A shadow shifted near a stack of wooden crates at the mouth of the alley. It was quick, too quick for a casual observer to notice, but Eli's eyes were trained for such subtleties. He stopped and turned, his body positioned defensively, his sharp gaze scanning the darkness. "If you're thinking of pulling something," he called out, his voice steady but edged with authority, "I'd reconsider." Silence. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a laugh, A low, menacing chuckle cut through the quiet. The sound was unnervingly close, echoing off the alley walls. Eli's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, gripping the small tactical flashlight. It wasn't much, but he knew how to use it to blind and disorient. He shifted his weight, ready to move, ready for anything. The laugh grew louder, joined by others, at least 3, maybe more. They were surrounding him. He wasn't being paranoid. This was a coordinated setup. "Well, well," a voice drawled from the shadows. "Look what we have here. The old man who can't keep his mouth shut." Eli didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath, steadying himself as his mind calculated his options. He'd faced worse odds in darker places, but something told him this wasn't just a random mugging. "What do you want?" Eli asked, his tone calm but firm. A figure stepped forward, the dim light revealing a tall, wiry young man with an air of arrogance. His leather jacket gleamed, and the smirk on his face was as sharp as the blade he casually flipped in his hand. "We're here to deliver a message," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "From some people who aren't too happy with your little hero act." Eli's jaw tightened. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was retaliation. Eli slowly scanned the alley, noting the positions of the other figures lurking in the shadows. There were at least 5 of them, spread out strategically. They weren't amateurs, but they weren't professionals either. He could tell by the way they moved, overconfident, sloppy in their posturing. "Big mistake," Eli muttered, more to himself than to them. "What was that?" the leader taunted, taking a step closer. "You got something to say, Grandpa?" Eli didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his stance, his mind already mapping out his first move. He knew he wouldn't get out of this without a fight. His only question now was how far these men were willing to go, and whether they truly understood who they were dealing with. The leader raised his knife, pointing it at Eli with a cocky grin. "You're gonna learn to keep your nose out of other people's business, starting tonight." Eli's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You should have stayed home, kid." The alley fell silent, the tension crackling like static electricity. And then, with a sharp whistle from the leader, the gang surged forward. The gang moved in like a pack of wolves, their movements synchronized but overconfident. Eli Thompson stood his ground, his body still, his sharp eyes tracking every motion. His heart was steady, not out of fear but anticipation. These men didn't know it yet, but they had just stepped into a fight they weren't prepared for. The first attacker lunged, a burly man wearing a hooded sweatshirt, his fists swinging wide. Eli sidestepped the blow effortlessly, his boots scuffing on the uneven pavement as he moved. Without hesitation, he delivered a calculated strike to the man's solar plexus, the impact sharp and precise. The attacker doubled over, gasping for air as he stumbled backward. "First mistake," Eli muttered under his breath, his voice calm and low. He didn't need to taunt. His actions spoke louder. The other gang members hesitated for a fraction of a second, their confidence wavering at the unexpected display of skill. But the leader, Ryan Harlow, barked a command, his voice slicing through their uncertainty. "Don't just stand there! Get him!" 2 attackers charged simultaneously. Eli stepped back, using the narrow confines of the alley to his advantage. The man on his left swung a metal pipe, the weapon whistling through the air, while the other aimed a crude punch at Eli's head. Eli ducked low, the pipe missing him by inches and crashing into the brick wall behind him with a deafening clang. Using the momentum of his movement, Eli pivoted and drove his elbow into the second attacker's ribs, the impact sending him sprawling to the ground. Before the man with the pipe could recover, Eli seized his wrist in a vice-like grip, twisting sharply. The pipe clattered to the ground as the attacker cried out in pain. Eli followed through with a swift kick to the man's knee, forcing him to collapse. The remaining gang members circled Eli, their faces a mix of anger and unease. Blood trickled down Eli's forearm from a shallow cut, proof that even a veteran could bleed. He wiped it against his jacket, his expression unreadable as he shifted his weight, preparing for the next assault. Ryan stepped forward, brandishing a knife with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His lips curled into a sneer. "Not bad, old man, but you're bleeding. Let's see how long you can keep up." Eli didn't respond. His focus was entirely on Ryan now. The leader's movements were cocky, telegraphed. He was skilled enough to intimidate street thugs, but to Eli, it was like watching an amateur sparring match. Ryan lunged with the blade, aiming for Eli's midsection. Eli sidestepped, grabbing Ryan's wrist and twisting sharply, forcing the knife downward. With a calculated move, Eli drove the hilt of the knife into Ryan's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through the gang leader. Ryan stumbled back, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You son of a—" The remaining gang members, seeing their leader falter, rushed Eli in desperation. Eli moved quickly, using the darkness and the cluttered alley to his advantage. He ducked behind a stack of wooden crates, disappearing into the shadows as the gang scrambled to regroup. From the darkness, Eli struck. He emerged suddenly, using a discarded trash can lid as a makeshift shield to deflect a blow from one attacker. He followed up with a swift uppercut, the force of the punch sending the man crashing into a pile of debris. Another attacker came from behind, attempting to grab Eli in a chokehold. Eli shifted his weight and threw the man over his shoulder, the attacker landing with a sickening thud on the pavement. Breathing heavily, Eli paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping the alley. 4 men were down, groaning and clutching their injuries. Only Ryan and one other attacker remained standing. Ryan, now visibly shaken but still defiant, stood in the center of the alley. His knife trembled in his hand, the earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. The last gang member, a lanky young man who couldn't have been more than 20, hesitated, his eyes darting between Eli and Ryan. Ryan spat on the ground, his voice hoarse with rage. "What are you waiting for? Take him down!" The young man shook his head, dropping the weapon he'd been holding. "I'm out," he said, backing away slowly before turning and running into the night. Ryan was alone now, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Eli stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his shadow stretching long in the dim light. "You had your chance," Eli said, his voice cold. "You should have walked away." Ryan lunged, his movements wild and desperate. Eli deflected the attack, disarming him with a quick twist of the wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and before Ryan could react, Eli swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back. Eli stood over Ryan, his expression unreadable as the gang leader writhed in pain. "This is over," Eli said, turning to leave. But Ryan's voice stopped him in his tracks. "You think you've won?" Ryan sneered, his tone dripping with venom. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Eli paused, his back turned to Ryan, who was sprawled on the damp pavement. The gang leader's taunting words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Ryan repeated, his voice more desperate than defiant now. Eli turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto Ryan. "Enlighten me," he said, his tone cold and sharp. Ryan chuckled bitterly, wiping the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You really think this ends here? My father runs this city. The police, the courts, they all answer to him. You won't get far." Eli's eyes narrowed. Harlow. The name clicked in his mind like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Mayor Vincent Harlow, the man Eli had recently exposed for embezzling city funds, meant for veterans' housing projects. This wasn't just a random act of street violence. It was retaliation. Eli stepped closer, crouching down so his face was level with Ryan's. "Your father sent you," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "That coward sent his son to do his dirty work?" Ryan glared at him, his pride wounded. "You're done, old man. When the cops get here, you'll be the one in cuffs. Assault on a bunch of innocent kids? Good luck explaining that." Eli's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes remained cold. "Let them come." Sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Eli stood tall, his silhouette cast long against the alley walls as flashing blue and red lights painted the scene in chaotic hues. The tension in the air thickened. Two police cruisers skidded to a halt at the alley's entrance, their doors swinging open. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Hands in the air!" one of them barked. Eli raised his hands slowly, his posture calm but deliberate. He didn't resist as they approached, their suspicion evident. One officer grabbed his arm, cuffing him roughly, while another began questioning the battered gang members. Ryan, still sprawled on the ground, played his role with theatrical flair. "He attacked us!" he shouted, his voice hoarse but filled with false indignation. "We were just walking home, and he jumped us out of nowhere." Eli didn't flinch, didn't speak. He knew better than to argue. The truth would come out soon enough. As Eli was led toward the police cruiser, Ryan's expression shifted. A smug smile crept across his face as he whispered something to the officer nearest him. The officer nodded subtly, then turned to Eli. "You're under arrest for assault and battery," the officer declared. Eli frowned, but remained silent. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to frame him, but the weight of the cuffs around his wrists and the stares from the officers were a bitter reminder of how power could twist justice. As the officers loaded Eli into the back seat, Ryan limped over, leaning heavily on one of his remaining cronies for support. He stopped just short of the cruiser, his smirk widening. "You're finished, Thompson. By the time my dad's through with you, you'll be wishing we'd ended this here tonight." Eli met Ryan's gaze through the window, his expression stoic. "You're more like your father than you realize," he said quietly. "But even he won't be able to save you when the truth comes out." Ryan laughed, turning away as the cruisers pulled out of the alley, their sirens cutting through the night. The ride to the precinct was silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Eli leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew his record and reputation would eventually clear him. What concerned him was the deeper corruption at play, the strings being pulled behind the scenes to silence him. As they arrived at the station, Eli's demeanor shifted. He was no longer just a man wrongfully arrested. He was a soldier preparing for the next battle. Inside the station, Eli was seated in a holding cell, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Minutes stretched into an hour, but Eli's patience didn't waver. He knew help was coming. It always did. Finally, the sound of boots echoed down the hall. A familiar figure appeared. Detective Carla Reyes, a no-nonsense officer Eli had worked with during his whistleblowing efforts. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, narrowing when they landed on him. "What the hell is this?" she snapped at the desk sergeant. "Assault and battery," the sergeant replied, shuffling through paperwork. "Caught him roughing up some kids in an alley." Reyes's jaw tightened as she grabbed the file, skimming through the details. Then she turned to Eli. "You good?" she asked, her tone softer. Eli nodded once. Been through worse. Reyes pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. Moments later, she held it up, revealing a live feed recording from Eli's body camera, a precaution he'd taken after receiving threats following his whistleblowing. The footage showed the entire ambush, from the gang's initial taunts to Ryan's admission of his father's involvement. The room fell silent as the officers watched the video. The sergeant's face paled. We didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't ask," Reyes shot back, her voice cold. She turned to Eli, unlocking the holding cell. "You're free to go, and don't worry. This isn't over." As Eli stepped out of the station, the cold night air hit him like a cleansing wave. Reyes walked beside him, her face grim but determined. "This goes deeper than we thought," she said. "Ryan and his father have been using their influence to cover up crimes for years. Tonight just gave us the leverage we need to bring them down." Eli nodded, his expression hard. "Then let's finish it." The camera zooms out as Eli walks away from the station, the lights of the city gleaming in the distance. The battle wasn't over, but Eli was ready for whatever came next. The air was thick with a storm that had yet to break as Eli Thompson stepped into the darkened streets, free but far from done. Detective Carla Reyes walked beside him, her stride purposeful and her eyes sharp with determination. "I'll have to be careful," Reyes said, her voice low. "The Harlow family has their fingers in every corner of this city. If they catch wind that we're building a case, they'll try to bury it, just like they tried to bury you." Eli nodded, his face a mask of quiet resolve. "They'll try, but this time they're up against the wrong people." Back at Reyes's office, the two pored over documents, recordings, and case files, connecting the dots of a sprawling web of corruption. Every thread led back to Mayor Vincent Harlow. Embezzlement, bribery, and ties to organized crime. But it was Ryan's recklessness that gave them their strongest lead. The video footage from the body camera showed Ryan confessing to his father's involvement in orchestrating the ambush. A smoking gun that couldn't be ignored. Reyes leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "We have enough to push forward, but we'll need more to ensure this sticks. If Harlow senses we're coming, he'll destroy evidence, threaten witnesses, and close ranks." Eli's eyes darkened. "Then we force his hand. We make him overplay it." The plan was simple but dangerous. Reyes would leak selective information to trusted sources, creating a ripple effect that would draw out the mayor's inner circle. Meanwhile, Eli would operate in the shadows, confronting key players to destabilize the network. Eli's first target was Trevor Gaines, a mid-level enforcer for the mayor's criminal connections. Trevor was known for his short temper and loose tongue, making him the perfect pawn. Eli tracked him to a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the lights were dim and no one asked questions. Eli entered silently, his presence barely drawing attention. He spotted Trevor at a corner table, a large man with a hulking frame and a perpetual sneer. Without a word, Eli approached and sat across from him. Trevor looked up, surprised at first, then amused. "Well, if it isn't the hero of the hour, you're brave showing your face here." Eli didn't flinch. "You're going to tell me everything you know about the Harlows." Trevor laughed, leaning back in his chair. "And why would I do that?" Eli placed a small device on the table, a recording of Ryan's confession. Trevor's laughter died instantly, his face paling. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he stammered. Eli leaned in, his voice deadly quiet. "You're right. I don't. But I know what you're afraid of. And I promise, what I'll do to you is nothing compared to what your boss will do when he realizes you're the weak link." Trevor broke. Within hours, Reyes had signed affidavits detailing Trevor's involvement in extortion schemes tied directly to the mayor's office. The information was a gold mine, implicating not only Ryan, but several high-ranking officials in the city's administration. As the walls began to close in, Vincent Harlow took the offensive. News reports painted Eli as a violent agitator, using doctored footage and fabricated witness statements to discredit him. But Reyes anticipated the move, countering with an official press release backed by hard evidence. The city erupted in chaos. Protests broke out as the public learned of the mayor's crimes. Harlow's once ironclad grip on the city began to slip. Late one night, Eli received a call from Reyes. Her voice was tight with urgency. "We've got him. Mayor Harlow is holed up in his estate, shredding files and trying to flee. If we don't act now, he's gone." Eli didn't hesitate. Within the hour, he joined Reyes and a small team of federal agents outside the Harlow mansion, a sprawling estate that screamed opulence and corruption. The raid was swift and surgical. Eli moved through the halls with the precision of a soldier, his every step calculated. He found Ryan first, cowering in his father's study, surrounded by scattered papers and empty liquor bottles. "You," Ryan spat, his bravado gone. "This is your fault." Eli didn't respond. He simply stared, his presence enough to silence Ryan. In the next room, Vincent Harlow stood by a burning fireplace, a man cornered but still defiant. He turned as Eli entered, his expression a mix of contempt and fear. "You think you've won?" Harlow snarled. "You're just a soldier, disposable." Eli stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe, but men like you always forget one thing." "And what's that?" Eli's gaze hardened. "We don't stop fighting." Harlow's arrest was broadcast across the city, his name forever tarnished. The evidence uncovered during the raid sealed his fate, ensuring he would face justice in a court of law. In the weeks that followed, the city began to heal. With Vincent Harlow removed from power, investigations into his network continued, uncovering decades of corruption. Ryan was sentenced to prison for his role in the ambush and other crimes, his family's name reduced to a cautionary tale. As for Eli, he returned to his quiet life, though his presence remained a beacon of resilience. On a cool autumn morning, he stood at a veteran's memorial, his hand brushing the names etched into the stone. "They tried to bury us," he murmured, "but they forgot we're the roots." Eli walked away, his head held high. The battle was over, for now, but he knew there would always be more fights ahead. And he would be ready. The city was waking up to a new era, though the scars of corruption still marred its streets. News of Vincent Harlow's arrest dominated the airwaves. Footage of him being led away in handcuffs, his head bowed but his expression defiant, was replayed endlessly. The once powerful mayor was now the symbol of systemic decay brought to its knees. But for Eli Thompson, the fight wasn't about making headlines. It was about honoring the principles he had lived by, protecting the vulnerable and exposing injustice, no matter the cost. Eli sat in his modest kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. He nursed a mug in his hands, his gaze distant. The past weeks had been a whirlwind, but now, in the stillness of the morning, the weight of it all began to settle on him. He glanced at the pile of newspapers on his counter, their headlines bold and triumphant. Mayor Vincent Harlow, arrested in corruption scandal. Veteran whistleblower sparks citywide cleanup. Eli pushed the papers aside. The accolades meant little to him. He wasn't a hero. He was just doing what needed to be done. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Rising slowly, He opened it to find Detective Carla Reyes standing there, a folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was serious, but her eyes held a glimmer of respect. "Morning, Reyes," Eli said, stepping aside to let her in. "Morning," she replied, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. She placed the folder in front of her but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked at him, her gaze steady. "We did it, Eli. Harlow's network is crumbling, but there's still work to do." Reyes slid the folder across the table. Eli opened it, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. Inside were documents and photographs, details of a criminal enterprise even larger than he'd anticipated. The Harlows had been a piece of the puzzle, but there were others: politicians, businessmen, enforcers, all tied together in a shadowy web of greed and power. "This isn't over," Reyes said. "Harlow was just the tip of the iceberg. His arrest has sent shockwaves through their ranks, but some of them are already moving to fill the void. If we don't act fast, they'll rebuild." Eli closed the folder, his jaw tightening. "What's the plan?" Reyes leaned forward, her tone resolute. "I need someone like you, someone who knows how to navigate the shadows. You've already shaken them. They're scared of you, Eli. That's an advantage we can't waste." Eli considered her words, the weight of the responsibility settling on him. He'd fought his battles, and part of him longed for peace. But he also knew that walking away now would leave the fight unfinished. "All right," he said finally, "but we do it on my terms." Before diving deeper into the new investigation, Eli had one piece of unfinished business: Ryan Harlow. The young man had been sentenced to a state prison, his privilege stripped away. But Eli wasn't seeking revenge. He needed answers. The visit was arranged quietly. In the sterile confines of the prison visitation room, Eli sat across from Ryan, who looked far less smug than the last time they'd met. Gone were the expensive clothes and the cocky grin. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now held a flicker of fear. "What do you want?" Ryan muttered, avoiding Eli's gaze. Eli leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "The truth. Why did your father send you after me?" Ryan hesitated, then shrugged. "He wanted you out of the picture. Said you were poking your nose where it didn't belong." "And you just went along with it?" Eli pressed. Ryan's jaw clenched. "You don't get it. You think I had a choice? My father. He controlled everything. Me, my mother, the city. Saying no wasn't an option." Eli studied him, searching for any sign of sincerity. He saw a broken young man, a product of his environment, but not a victim. Ryan had made his choices, and now he was paying for them. "Your father's gone," Eli said. "You're free of him now. What you do next is up to you." Ryan looked up, his eyes filled with something resembling regret. "What do you want me to do?" Eli stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Make it right. When you're out of here, use what you know to help clean up the mess your father left behind. Otherwise, you're just as guilty as he was." Eli returned home that evening, his mind heavy with the conversation. He knew Ryan's redemption wasn't guaranteed, but he also knew that the young man's knowledge could be invaluable in the fight ahead. Reyes called later that night, her voice steady but urgent. "Eli, we've got a lead. There's a meeting of some key players tomorrow night. City officials, business tycoons, the works. If we can intercept it, we might just take down the rest of the network." Eli's response was immediate. "Tell me where." That night, Eli prepared for what was to come. He checked his gear: a small camera, a handheld recorder, and a tactical knife he hoped he wouldn't have to use. He wasn't just a man walking into a fight. He was a soldier on a mission. Before heading to bed, Eli sat at his desk and pulled out an old photograph. It was of his unit, taken years ago in a distant land. The faces of his fallen comrades stared back at him, their smiles frozen in time. "I'll do this for you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "For all of us." The following evening, the city lay under a blanket of quiet unease. In the heart of its wealthiest district stood the Ashwood Club, a private venue where the powerful gathered to make deals away from prying eyes. Tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. Key players in the corruption network were convening, scrambling to regain control after the fall of Vincent Harlow. But they had no idea that Eli Thompson and Detective Carla Reyes were already several steps ahead. Eli adjusted the black cap on his head as he approached the Ashwood Club's service entrance. Dressed as a maintenance worker, he blended into the shadows of the alley, his movements deliberate and silent. He tapped the hidden earpiece connected to Reyes. "I'm in position," he whispered. Reyes's voice crackled in his ear. "Good. The main meeting is happening in the lounge on the second floor. Security's tight. Be careful." Eli slipped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the narrow corridor. The sound of distant conversation and clinking glasses filtered through the walls. He moved swiftly, disabling a surveillance camera with a flick of his knife and ducking into the service elevator. As the elevator ascended, he checked his equipment. A concealed camera and audio recorder. Tonight wasn't about brute force. It was about gathering the evidence needed to expose the network in its entirety. From his vantage point behind a partition on the second floor, Eli could see them. A group of men and women seated around a lavish table, their faces etched with tension. The air was thick with desperation as they discussed how to salvage their crumbling empire. "We need to move fast," one man said, his voice clipped. "If we don't control the narrative, we're finished." Another, a woman with sharp features and a calculating gaze, replied, "The press is already digging too deep. We need to silence anyone who can connect us to Harlow." Eli's jaw tightened as he pressed a button on the recorder. Their words would be their undoing. As Eli listened, the faint creak of a floorboard behind him made his blood run cold. He turned just in time to see a burly security guard lunging at him. The man had spotted him slipping into the restricted area. Eli reacted instinctively, sidestepping the guard and striking him with a swift elbow to the jaw. The guard staggered but recovered quickly, drawing a baton and swinging it with force. Eli dodged, grabbing a nearby serving tray and using it to deflect the blow. The clash was brief but brutal. Eli's military training kicked in as he disarmed the guard with a precise maneuver, rendering him unconscious with a well-placed strike to the temple. The commotion hadn't gone unnoticed. Voices in the lounge grew louder, and footsteps echoed down the hallway. Eli quickly secured the guard's body out of sight and moved to reposition himself. The lounge doors burst open, and several members of the meeting spilled out, flanked by additional security. At their head was Douglas Vance, a prominent businessman with ties to nearly every major corruption scandal in the city. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the corridor. Eli stepped into the light, his presence commanding. "Evening," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Looks like I crashed your little party." Vance's lips curled into a sneer. "You've been a thorn in our side for far too long, Thompson, but you've overplayed your hand." Behind Vance, two guards drew their weapons. Eli raised his hand slightly, his stance relaxed but ready. "You think killing me will solve your problems? You've already lost. The evidence I've gathered tonight is enough to bury all of you." Vance laughed coldly. "You think you'll leave here alive?" Before anyone could react, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows as a team of law enforcement officers, led by Reyes, stormed the building. Chaos erupted as the officers moved in, shouting commands and subduing the guards. Vance and his associates attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Eli stepped aside as Reyes approached, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "It's over, Vance," she said, her tone sharp. "We've got everything we need to bring you and your cronies down." Vance snarled, his bravado crumbling. "You'll regret this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Reyes smirked. "Neither did you." As the officers cuffed the conspirators, Eli handed Reyes the recorder. Every word they said in there. Enough to dismantle their entire operation. Reyes nodded, a rare smile crossing her face. "Good work, Eli. This city owes you." The arrests made headlines the next day, marking a turning point in the city's history. The corruption network was dismantled piece by piece, its members facing justice for their crimes. Eli, true to his nature, avoided the spotlight. As the media celebrated the takedown, he returned to his quiet life, content knowing he had done his part. One evening, Eli stood at the edge of a park overlooking the city skyline. The lights twinkled in the distance, a symbol of hope and resilience. Reyes joined him, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "They'll rebuild," she said softly. "Corruption always tries to creep back." Eli nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but there'll always be people like us to stop it." Reyes smiled. "You ever think about coming back full-time? We could use someone like you." Eli chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not a cop, but if you ever need a soldier, you know where to find me." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. Then, without another word, Eli turned and walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the night.